The morning of January 17th, 1945, dawned cold and iron gray over the industrial heartland of America. Frost clung to the edges of Route 66 as it carved through the Oklahoma plains, a ribbon of asphalt stretching toward the horizon like a promise. The air smelled of diesel and cold earth. Truck drivers hauled steel and grain toward distant war factories. Families in Ford sedans traveled to visit sons in uniform before they shipped overseas. No one on that highway, on that ordinary winter morning, knew they were about to witness something extraordinary, something that would ripple through military aviation history and redefine what was possible when the impossible pressed down like gravity itself. At 8:47 a.m., Major William Hendricks lifted his B-17 Flying Fortress off the runway at Tinker Field, leading a formation of 12 bombers on what should have been a routine training sortie. These were not rookies. These were men who had survived the fire over Bremen and the flak-torn skies above Schweinfurt. They had learned to trust their machines and each other with a faith born in the furnace of combat. But faith, Hendricks knew, was no substitute for hydraulics. And at 9:23 a.m., when the port-side engine began hemorrhaging oil in thick black streams and the control surfaces locked rigid as stone, faith was all he had left. The B-17 was America's answer to the doctrine of strategic bombing, a doctrine that demanded aircraft fly higher, farther, and heavier than anything the enemy could field. It was a machine built of aluminum and ambition, bristling with .50 caliber machine guns, capable of carrying 4,000 pounds of ordnance across an ocean and back. But it was also a machine that required hydraulics to bank, to descend, to respond to the subtle pressures of a pilot's hand. Without those systems, the Flying Fortress became a 30-ton coffin with wings. Hendricks felt the yoke go dead in his hands. No response. The altimeter showed 6,000 feet and falling. The co-pilot, Lieutenant James Cordell, cycled through emergency procedures with the mechanical precision drilled into him by 1,000 hours of training. Pump the backup, bleed the lines. Nothing. The bomber wanted to fall, and gravity is patient. The rest of the formation scattered like startled birds, their pilots watching helplessly as Hendricks' aircraft began a slow, inevitable spiral toward the Oklahoma farmland below. In that moment, Hendricks faced a choice that every combat pilot dreads. He could order his crew to bail out, to scatter themselves across the countryside and pray their parachutes opened clean. He could ride the aircraft into an empty field, trading his life and those of his men for the safety of strangers below. Or he could do something no one in the history of American military aviation had ever attempted. He could try to land a 4-engine bomber, crippled and unresponsive, on a 2-lane highway. What the German Luftwaffe pilots who had faced the B-17 over Europe expected was predictable. They expected American pilots to follow doctrine, to adhere to the rigid structures of military training, to value the machine over improvisation. The Germans had built their Air Force on precision, every maneuver calculated, every formation textbook perfect. They believed the Americans were reckless cowboys, yes, but cowboys who would panic when the script went wrong. They expected the bomber to auger into the earth in a ball of flame and twisted metal, the way so many had over Hamburg and Berlin. What they did not expect, what no one expected, was innovation born of desperation. Hendricks scanned the landscape below. The highway cut straight through the plains, a strip of clear asphalt bordered by shallow ditches and winter-dead grass. No power lines, no overpasses for 3 miles in either direction. It was insane. It violated every principle of aeronautical engineering. But it was possible. Barely. He keyed the radio. "Tinker Tower, this is Red Eagle 6. I've got hydraulic failure, full lockup. I'm putting her down on Route 66, 2 miles east of the junction. Clear the road." There was a pause, static. Then the voice of the tower operator, tight with disbelief. "Say again, Red Eagle 6? You're landing where?" "Route 66. Clear the goddamn road." Below, Oklahoma State Police Sergeant Roy McKinney was cruising westbound when the call came through on his radio. At first, he thought it was a prank. Land a bomber on a highway? Impossible. But then he heard it.
the deep, growling thunder of 4 Wright Cyclone engines descending from the clouds. He looked up through his windshield and saw it, the silver belly of the B-17, growing larger, wings wobbling as Hendricks fought to keep it level with throttle control alone. McKinney slammed his patrol car into a U-turn, flipped on his siren, and began racing ahead of the descending bomber, waving civilian cars off the road. A milk truck swerved into a ditch. A woman in a Chevrolet screamed and pulled onto the shoulder. The highway began to empty. Hendricks had no flaps, no rudder authority. He was landing a glider made of iron. At 200 feet, the bomber's shadow raced across the farmland, swallowing fence posts and barns. At 100 feet, the wheels, mercifully functional, dropped down and locked. At 50 feet, Cordell began calling out airspeed. 130, 120, too fast, Bill, too fast. I know. They crossed the threshold at 110 miles per hour, far too fast for any safe landing, but the only speed Hendricks could manage without stalling. The main gear kissed the asphalt with a shriek of rubber and the groan of overstressed metal. The tail dropped. The bomber bounced once, hard, then settled, engines roaring as Hendricks chopped the throttles. The brakes, mechanical, blessedly independent of hydraulics, bit into the wheels. The B-17 thundered down Route 66, devouring a mile of asphalt in seconds. Air brakes useless, momentum fighting every inch of friction.
Sergeant McKinney, a quarter-mile ahead, saw the bomber bearing down on him like a freight train made of wings. He accelerated, staying just ahead of the careening aircraft, his heart hammering against his ribs. Hendricks stood on the brakes. The tires began to smoke, then scream. The bomber slewed left, the wingtip dropping toward the ditch, then righted itself. Slower, slower. At the 2-mile mark, with a final shudder, the flying fortress came to rest. Silence. Hendricks sat in the cockpit, his hands still gripping the yoke, his breathing shallow. Cordell stared at him. From the back of the aircraft, the crew, navigator, bombardier, gunners, began to laugh, the kind of laughter that comes after terror has released its grip. They had landed a bomber on a highway. They were alive. Within minutes, the road was swarming with police, reporters, and locals who had watched the impossible unfold. Photographers captured the image that would appear in newspapers from Los Angeles to New York. A B-17 flying fortress sitting on Route 66 like a strange silver landmark, its propellers still, its crew standing beside it in flight suits, grinning with the wild disbelief of men who had cheated death. The headline in the Oklahoma City Times read, "Miracle on 66, bomber lands on highway, no casualties." But the story was more than a miracle. It was evidence. The Germans, when they learned of it, and they did through intelligence channels and intercepted press reports, could not reconcile what had happened with their understanding of American pilots. This was not recklessness. This was not luck. This was improvisation at the highest level, the kind of adaptability that came from a culture that rewarded independent thinking over blind obedience. In the Luftwaffe, such a decision would have required approval from 3 levels of command. Hendricks had made it in seconds. This was the secret the Axis powers never fully grasped. American airmen were not better because their aircraft were faster or their bombs heavier. They were better because they were trained to think. The American military, for all its bureaucracy, had been shaped by a civilian culture that prized ingenuity, that celebrated the mechanic who could fix an engine with a screwdriver and a prayer, the farmer who could coax life from barren soil. When doctrine failed, Americans rewrote it mid-flight. The B-17 itself became a symbol of this philosophy. It was a machine designed with redundancy, with the expectation that things would go wrong. It could fly with 1 engine out, 2 engines out. It could absorb punishment that would shred a Messerschmitt and still bring its crew home. But more than the machine, it was the men inside who made the difference. Hendricks had not been given a manual for landing on a highway. He had been given the judgment to try. In the months that followed, the military studied Hendricks's landing.
Engineers measured the impact forces, calculated the deceleration rates, analyzed the structural integrity of the bomber after the landing. What they found astonished them. The aircraft was repairable. Within 2 weeks, the B-17 was airworthy again. It returned to Tinker Field, was assigned a new crew, and flew training missions until the war ended. The highway bore scars, long black streaks of rubber, a few cracked sections of pavement, but it too was repaired. Route 66 carried on, as it always had, carrying Americans toward their futures. Hendricks was awarded the Distinguished Flying Cross. The citation praised his extraordinary skill and courage in the face of imminent disaster. But Hendricks himself, in interviews years later, would downplay the heroism. "I just didn't want to die on a Wednesday, and I sure as hell wasn't going to take anyone else with me." That humility, that refusal to accept the mantle of the extraordinary, was itself quintessentially American. The greatest acts were performed by ordinary men who simply refused to accept that the impossible was impossible. This was the ideological weapon the Axis could never counter. It was not a bomb or a bullet. It was the belief, embedded deep in the American psyche, that the rules could be rewritten if survival demanded it. The Germans had expected rigidity. They got improvisation. The Japanese had expected fatalism. They got stubborn optimism. And over, in 1,000 unnamed moments across the Pacific and Europe, that gap between expectation and reality cost the Axis dearly. Hendricks's landing became legend in military aviation circles. It was studied at West Point and the Air Force Academy. Pilots told the story to new recruits as evidence that training was a foundation, not a ceiling. You learned the rules so that when the moment came, you would know which ones to break. The highway landing was cited in safety briefings, in accident investigations, in debates over aircraft design. It became proof that human judgment, honed by culture and experience, could outperform even the best engineering. But perhaps the most profound impact was quieter, less measurable. The civilians on Route 66 that day, the truck drivers, the families, Sergeant McKinney, they saw something that confirmed a truth they had always believed but rarely witnessed. They saw that Americans could be trusted to do the right thing, even when the right thing was insane. Hendricks had not asked permission. He had not waited for orders. He had assessed the situation, made a decision, and executed it with precision. And in doing so, he had saved not just his crew, but everyone on that highway who might have been in the path of a crashing bomber. This was the unspoken contract of democracy. The system worked not because it was perfect, but because it empowered individuals to act when the system failed. The Germans built machines that ran like clockwork. The Americans built machines that could be fixed with a wrench and a curse. The Germans built armies that obeyed.
The answer was simple, and it was terrifying. American chaos was not chaos at all. It was controlled improvisation, creativity under pressure, the refusal to accept defeat even when the instruments of war betrayed you. It was the inheritance of a nation built by pioneers who had crossed an ocean on faith and carved cities from wilderness with determination. It was the legacy of a people who believed that problems existed to be solved, not endured. Years after the war, the stretch of Route 66 where Hendricks landed was widened, repaved, modernized. The ditches were filled in, the farmland gave way to suburbs. But locals still told the story. They pointed to a spot on the highway and said, "That's where the bomber landed." And children would stare at the asphalt, trying to imagine the thunder of 4 engines, the screech of tires, the impossible made real. Hendricks lived to be 83. He never flew combat missions. His war was spent training the pilots who would. But those pilots carried his lesson with them into the skies over Europe and the Pacific. They carried the knowledge that the book could be rewritten, that survival sometimes demanded audacity, and that the line between heroism and madness was thinner than anyone wanted to admit. In the end, the highway landing was not just about one pilot and one bomber. It was about a philosophy of war,
a way of thinking that valued the individual's judgment as much as the machine's capability. It was about trust that the man in the cockpit would make the right decision, even if that decision had never been made before. And it was about the terrifying freedom of knowing that when everything went wrong, there was no one to rely on but yourself. The Germans feared this, the Japanese could not comprehend it, and the Americans, for all their youth as a nation, had perfected it. On that cold January morning in 1945, when Major William Hendricks set his crippled bomber down on Route 66, he did more than save lives. He demonstrated in a single desperate act the secret advantage that had been there all along, the advantage not of steel or fire, but of the unyielding belief that men, given the freedom to think and the courage to act, could achieve the impossible. And the highway, scarred and silent, bore witness to that truth.